This is the Simply Real TV podcast, where we discuss the practical differences between true Christianity and the spiritually corrupt game that is commonly accepted as Christian faith in the world today. I'm Michael Hildebrandt, and today is part one of a real-life example of a man who has lost his family for the sake of Christ. The opinions expressed in this podcast are based on the voice of God. All right, well, thanks for coming. I really appreciate you being here. I've really been looking forward to this podcast for a while. I know you have as well. And man, I just want to say for everybody out there, you know, and for you and for my sake, this is a story that is meant to help anybody out there who's going through something similar, and really, we'll get into that real quick. So I want to read a verse. This is Matthew 10:34 through 36. Jesus says, "Do not think that I came to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I came to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be the members of his household." And the real big thing that I want to start at, before we get into the details of the story, is that reality that God still sets people against their family today. What was true then is true now, and there's a reason for it. So in today's example, we've got a guy who will remain nameless, as will all the members of your story will remain nameless just to protect identities. But we've got a guy who has lost his marriage, effectively lost relationship with your sons, only for the reason of following God, right? None of the typical reasons of, you know, some kind of addiction or marital infidelity or like financial problems, those things that typically lead people to divorce and separate and go their separate ways. Those were not the reasons. And that because Jesus is still doing the same thing today as he was doing then. And we just don't see it much because there really are very few people actually following Christ. So now I also want to say too, I mean, plenty will claim, that they've separated or marriages have failed because of religious differences. You know, one is Jewish, the other is Presbyterian, or, take the extreme example. One is into Scientology and the other is Taoist or Buddhist or something like that. Okay, neither one of them are following God. And so for them to separate on a religious basis is not the same thing as what we're talking about.
No, absolutely not.
We're talking about, in marriage, you got two people, right? One of them makes a decision to follow God and give everything, and the other person does not. And that leads to a division that ruins the marriage. And the reason why Jesus made this statement about having come into the world not to bring peace but a sword is because of this reality that the world hates God so much that anybody who willingly lays down their own life and puts God above all of the priorities is hated. And it's just a fact of life. It's just the way the world is. And so Jesus coming into the world and representing everything that God wants and being his guy, well, that's a sword to everyone that hates hates the Father that he's here to represent. So that pull is so strong that it breaks family ties, and just because we don't see this much doesn't mean it doesn't happen.
Absolutely.
So that's the big preface that I want to give to this whole story. That's the backdrop. And so as you're listening to this, look at it in those terms. Now, I also want to make a point before we get started. You know, this division that's going on in your family, this division that's happened, and the division that he's talking about in Matthew 10:34 is not God's fault, right? God hates division. He hates divorce, right? And yet he gave a writ of divorce to faithless Israel and sent her away. That's Jeremiah 3:8. So it is wrong that people hate him and want to be divided from him, and yet he will allow it.
Yeah.
He will give them what they want, which is the worst thing for them, but that's how God views that. It's like, okay, clearly you don't want to be in this relationship. I'll allow this divorce, but I still hate it, right? That's God's heart.
You know, the marriage, it's a metaphor, right? And that could be a topic for a whole other
Right.
podcast and conversation. But just like in a real relationship with God, if I want to go my own way, he's going to let me do that. And that's exactly what this physical example we're going to talk about is the same type of spiritual point that happens in heart. So anyway.
Absolutely.
Agreement with you.
Absolutely. So as we get into this story, there's three major sections, and I've titled them beginning, middle, and end, which I thought was very appropriate.
Yeah.
So
it's not generic.
Yeah. The point of that is that people that are out there listening, any exception that's struggling to find God and wanting to change, they're going to find themselves more or less at one of these three sections. And the beginning part is you're not married yet. Maybe there's no one in the picture. Maybe there is. And you're starting to follow God and wondering, well, how do I do this? How do I follow God in this whole marriage, this blossoming relationship, whatever it is? And then there's the middle part which is where I was when I started following God or started to find God, which I already was married. And now I need to learn how to love this person in relationship and following God. It also means I need to learn how to die to that relationship and let them go so that my value is in God and not in this relationship, you know? And then there's the end, which is the marriage. It either already has crumbled or is crumbling. And it's like, well, how do we walk through that? And, you know, unless you're just never going to get married, and not everyone does, everyone's going to find themselves in one of these three sections, anyone that's involved in a relationship or a marriage at all. And the answer to all of those questions in every section is hear God, follow his voice, because he's speaking to everyone about how to walk that. So as you're listening, and we'll talk about it as we go through, just realize there's three sections, and one of them most likely will apply to you. So the beginning of your marriage, you know, there was you starting to find God, you starting to ask, where is the Lord? And God's getting to speak to you. And then there was the marriage and the running from God's call. So you were 21, right?
Mm-hmm.
21 years old, wanting more, and you start going to a Bible study, right?
Yeah, and you know, I had a very unique, just coming up through high school and college. You know, I grew up religious, and absolutely to just add a little color to what you said, you know, I had longed for something more, and I was considered by the youth group I was in and the college groups, you know, that I attended at church and various things to be more spiritual than most, right? But I knew that there was something amiss. And so I found myself looking for more and questioning. I wasn't your typical, you know, teenager and young college student. You know, I was reaching out, seeking God, knowing things weren't right. And so really leading up to, as you indicated, you know, God engaged me. He began speaking to me. He began revealing himself to me. And it was up to about the time that I met a young lady who was to become my wife. It was around the same time that I met Jeff. And there was a Bible study that was going on. I was actually teaching a Bible study at where I was living at the time, and I was meeting with a group, and Jeff had heard about it, and a guy that I was going to college with shared a class with, and they showed up. And at that point, I knew God began speaking to me, telling me, hey, what this guy's saying here is the truth, and you need to listen. And it became very evident that the thing that I had been searching for in my heart, which was really boiling down to real relationship with God, he was answering me, and he was trying to give that to me. But at the same time, I met this young lady, and I don't want to jump ahead here. I'll let you lead. But definitely presented a life choice that I had ahead of me.
Right. Yeah, and around this time, sounds like very early in that process of the Bible study and hearing God. God started speaking about responsibility for you, leadership responsibility, and that carries a lot of weight. And I mean, there's a lot of people that will feel called, to the ministry, and then they freak out because they don't want to be poor. They don't want to be that guy that is always busy every Sunday, or people are always calling in the evenings and they have to do visitation or whatever. I mean, these are, and this is all associated with the false church, right? And yet God still calls people wherever they are, wherever they find themselves, and people become afraid of that call.
Well,
right?
And they become afraid of it when it's real.
Yeah.
So let me give you just a little more context. Whenever I was in high school and then in college, I kind of had a unique story in that I wanted to go to the ministry. I wanted to be a pastor. In fact, but something was amiss. God was not telling me to go that traditional route. But that's what I wanted. And so the irony kind of what you're talking about here was, but again, all that was self, okay? And again, God was speaking to me. God did have a plan for me, but it needed to be outside of the context of my definition of what that was going to be. So then when I get smacked with, hey, I'm going to call you for real. Well, first of all, to know me, because he told me, Michael, before that I was a Pharisee. And I think that's what really perked Jeff's ears when he heard about this young guy, that was leading a Bible study and where I was living, that I made the statement that I was a Pharisee because that's what God told me. And here I was, the more spiritual one. Well, then fast forward, to your point, whenever it became clear that God was actually calling me to a real ministry, I freaked.
Yeah. And then it got
right?
real. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and there's the statement that we'll make is that everything's easy in the flesh. When it's your own idea and it aligns with what you would prefer. Well, it's easy to go to Africa when it's what you want.
Yeah.
But now when God says, no, it's not all that, it is what? What did he say specifically to you at the time?
Yeah, well, first it was, I need to die to myself. And it was very clear that God had brought Jeff into my life. He'd already told me that I needed to listen to him. And he knew that he had responsibility for me. And I think he'd even, had a dream or some type of a word from God where basically there was a Paul and Timothy type of relationship that needed to happen. And so I don't know that I understood what all that meant, but I did understand by extension there was responsibility associated with that. I mean, there was no question, because up until that point in my heart, my life, that was what I was feeling like was going to be true, in my heart, that God was calling me to something, but I just didn't really know what that looked like.
Right. So when God steps up, basically, and he has your ear now, mm-hmm. right? Your heart's beginning to change, and then he says things like, leave school.
Yeah.
Right? Walk away from the church that you're going to. And
yep.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
What was that like?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it was interesting because, Hey,
and I want to make the point. That's not a generic statement that I'm making. God told you
literally,
yeah, to leave because you were going to college.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And so this is where rubber meets the road, like you were talking about. God said, leave school.
Yep.
You leave school.
Yep.
Not, this is a great idea. People should leave. No.
Yeah.
God's mandate on your life: leave school, leave church, and what was the other thing?
Yeah, there were four things.
Four things.
There were
okay.
four things
All
going
right.
on, and those four things were, and they were very specific, and they all converged like at one time. Boom! I knew. And let me just say, I might have been a little contentious with Jeff, when I met him, but then it became very clear that when God made the point, hey, you need to listen to this guy, you need to be with this guy. These are the people you need to be with, and once I broke. And I submitted to that. Then there were four things that slapped me. One was I needed to quit college. And here's the thing: I like college. I like going. I didn't want to stop. I had almost 4 years, under my belt already. Right? I'd switched majors, so I still had a little work to do. But quit college. I need to stop going to the church that I was going to. Go work at McDonald's.
That's right. Yeah.
And then lastly, move in with Jeff. And dude, you talk about a whole lot of life change right there. That was a lot, but God is strategic, right? We refer to God as being sounds religious, the great physician He is, but man, in terms of surgical precision, He knows exactly where to cut the flesh. So that's what God was requiring. Of me.
Well, and that makes a really good point. I'm glad you brought up that whole thing about when it becomes real.
Yeah.
And this is something that, it's a statement that we make and that we observe readily with new people. It's like, okay, you're willing to accept all these statements that God is making. They're very hard and very tough. But where's that one you don't want to accept? Where does it become real for you and you have that oh crap moment of, oh, you mean I'm going to have to give all my life?
Yeah.
Where 10 seconds before it would have been readily agreed with, yes, I need to give all my life for God.
Yeah.
But when it becomes real for you is when God puts His finger on that thing in your heart. And we all have that opportunity. God is doing that for everybody. And so I find it very interesting that in the list of four things, you did three of them. Mm-hmm. So what was the one you didn't want to do and why?
So there was the whole moving in with Jeff thing, and there was concern that I had about the appearance of that, what that looked like. It scared me a little bit, right? So I'm cutting ties with all these things that were very familiar, and the last thing was moving in with this guy that I just met. Not that I had any concern about him being God's man, but it's what that meant for me and how I looked in my own eyes and in the eyes of the world. And so there was a part of me that wanted to avoid that.
So you didn't want to look like that crazy guy that's sleeping in another guy's, spare room, with some other this guy's in his family. And it's also, that's incredibly humbling for a young man who's on the rise, right?
Yeah.
You're the guy in spiritual circles because you're a Pharisee like them, and so you had success, which is very similar to my story early on. Okay, this is where you were headed, up, and this is... a huge down. And what's interesting too is you'd already known the woman that eventually became your wife, and you guys were you dating at that point, or?
Well, no, we just met. It was just kind of a unique timing there. You know?
Well, and you can see, and maybe I shouldn't get ahead of myself, but okay, fine. let's go ahead and go there. Then what happened is what happened then at that point? Because you kind of disappeared and then turns up married, right?
Yeah.
Or something to that effect.
So we're clicking along, God's speaking these things, and then I meet this young lady, and I did fall in love with her, okay? And this will come up, I'm sure, again later. Just because we fall in love with someone doesn't mean that that's the reason to get married. Right?
Boy, that right there is going to stick in a bunch of people's craw.
Yeah.
Because are we going to follow God, or are we going to follow what we're in love with?
Exactly.
And that applies to every aspect of our lives.
Absolutely.
But family, which it tends to be this thing. So anyway.
Yeah, well, there's more to say on that.
I know. I don't want to steal your thunder.
Smoldering on that one. But I met this young lady, fell in love with her, and quite honestly, I ran. I chose for a variety of motives, but the chief motive, I chose to marry her to escape. That was the main motive that I had in my heart, was to run away. And there was a lot baked into that. Okay, it had a lot of little tentacles and roots that really pushed me there. Everywhere from, hey, I could, move in and get married, and I could avoid that scenario,
right,
looking crazy, moving in with Jeff. I could also, there was a part of me, I wanted to maybe go through these things with someone and share these things. Again, totally wicked apart from God.
Right.
If that's not what God's speaking.
Absolutely, because what God was speaking is, why don't you walk through these things with Jeff?
Well,
He gave you someone to walk through it with.
And with him.
Right.
And the reality is, we are all going to stand before God and give an account alone.
Yeah.
Right? And it was very, very important that I walk through those things with him. Yeah, and absolutely, God put Jeff in my life to mentor me, to disciple me. There's no question. So there was that. There was even, we'll just also throw in a little into the mix as well. There was a part of me, I thought, okay, if I just go ahead and get married, then I don't have to worry about God telling me that I can't get married. And so, all that just kind of mixed up, shaken together, was a big hot mess of what was going on in my heart.
Wow.
But again, it all boils down to one root, and it's avoidance, right? It's avoidance. If we wanted to sum it up, pick your poison there, but it all culminates into that one thing, and that is, God was speaking, this is what I want you to do, this is the path I want you to walk, but instead, I chose to escape. Mm-hmm. And I did that in this case, in spite of him speaking to me, loving me. And this is just, we'll just go ahead and talk about my wickedness, okay? It would just delve into it. My sin is worse than most, because God actually spoke to me and said, don't do it.
Don't marry her.
Don't marry her. And he spoke it multiple times. But what did I do? I did it anyway. Okay? And we'll have a lot to talk about for the rest of the podcast.
Yes.
Because I guess if there's anything...
And guess what? That decision bore fruit.
It did.
Right? You reap what you sow.
That's exactly right. A good tree bears good fruit. A bad tree will bear bad fruit. And if we could have any quick takeaway with this for the people who are listening, always, always, always trust God and what he's telling you. And I know I don't want to steal your thunder later, because I know you can talk about Jeremiah. You're going to quote it. It can come up later, but I know the plans I have for you, right, to prosper you, not to harm you.
Absolutely.
And God loved me.
Dude, people love to quote that verse.
They do, but
where the nitty becomes gritty, now that's a phrase.
Sure. Why not?
It's where God puts his finger and says, this is the plan, and this is what I want for you. He wanted you to be Timothy and Jeff to be Paul, and that was the person you were supposed to walk through this learning, the human person, this whole learning how to follow God and answering his call. And he was also defining what home life was going to look like for you, which is sleeping in another man's spare room.
Yep.
Well, but then you went and created the thing that you wanted, right? Which was a home life and a wife and children and a job and all these things.
The happily ever after. I wanted all of that too, right? Which,
that's a problem.
God is a jealous God.
Yeah.
And not jealous in the way in our human terms define jealousy. His jealousy is for our good.
And he's actually worthy of everything.
Absolutely.
Unlike we are.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's exactly what you're saying, is you pursued this whole family life train, You know, you got on that track to go that way, and people do it every day. I did, except the thing for you is God had already made it clear that he had a different plan.
Yeah.
And so it's, and I think that's a good way to say it is to go ahead and own, well, my sin is worse than others in this case, because God said not to marry her. God said what you were actually called to. And so to choose the thing that we want in the face of what God has said, well, it's wicked.
Absolutely.
It's wrong, and yeah, it has devastating consequences. And so this whole relationship right from the beginning, or maybe after the meeting part, but where the relationship became real and the marriage and all that whole thing now was this direct conflict against what God had called you to. Now, God can make lemonade with lemons, right? I mean, he
ended up doing that to some degree.
Right.
Yeah.
He can do amazing things with the crap that we give him, but there's only so much that he can do to influence a heart, because he's not going to override our own choice, and we still have that involved in the mix. So that whole concept of the life that you wanted, that happily ever after, the home, your own home, right, with your own wife and your own environment, and this whole thing, this whole family ideal, that versus what God was calling you to became, you see now, within your own heart, before we get to the whole rest of the story, this is that distinction of the cost of losing in order to follow God.
Yeah.
Right? So the stage is already set for God setting a man against his family and bringing a sword rather than peace, because this cost is there right from the beginning, right?
And if I could throw one other thing in too, you talk about his plan, and because we've talked about, there were, well, first of all, and I keep coming back to it, I needed to learn to die to myself, right? And become his, because he hadn't told me that I was his at that point, right? He was speaking to me. I was hearing his voice. There's no question. That's the path we were on. But that was first, and then obviously there was responsibility beyond that. But when I think about also the very practical value of him telling me, don't get married, because there was an important life decision I needed to make for myself. I needed to learn how to be a single guy.
Yeah.
So just from the practical value, I got the cart before the horse. Okay, so then now by going and getting married, that now I've plunged two of us into that world where she didn't know God, I didn't know God, and now we got to understand we have to die to ourselves and now learn what it means to live within the context of a marriage relationship.
Right.
What a big jumbled mess that became. So again, God saw all that.
Right.
He knew all that. And hey, don't think for any minute there's not a begrudging of her that's in my heart. I had a greater transgression because I knew better and I made this decision, right? Now, sure, was she culpable? Yeah, she was agreeable. But back to that choice, I made that choice, and God, he knew that, and he wanted me to avoid that. So I just wanted to say, before we went any further, just kind of even looking at the practical value of, on a macro scale, but even on a micro scale, it's always best to hear God and to trust him over self.
Well, that's a really good point, because that's one of the things you got to consider. If you're really going to follow God, and you're at the beginning of our 3 stages of this story, if that's you, think about that. It's like, okay, God's asking me to live a life where I surrender everything. And maybe you're not even at that point where you know that that's what you want to do. Well, why would you throw another person into that mix that may not be what they want either?
Yeah,
I mean, that's selfish.
absolutely.
I mean, to have this person come along with you that's now not wanting to be there, ultimately is where that wound up. I mean, come on. It would have been so much simpler, like you said, to be the single man. And Paul makes that point. It's better to not have attachments. It doesn't mean God wouldn't have had someone for you to marry at some point, but, it's a straighter, much narrower path than simpler in that way. Costly, right?
Absolutely.
Costs you everything, and yet it is better.
Yeah.
So at this point, you went ahead and got married so that you didn't have to ask the question whether you should get married, even though God was telling you not to do it. So,
Yeah.
I mean, okay, at this point, now we're in the middle.
Yeah.
Now you're in it. And so the next little section is kind of the first 15 years of the marriage, right? This is where you both are attending Bible studies, you're trying to find God, and now learning, okay, I have this commitment to this other person. My life now is not just me in this world. My life is also her. And I need to follow God too, right? I need to follow God first. But how does that work, right? You're learning all that stuff. But in the process, you come back, right? And God makes the point even after. Now, he told you not to marry her. You did. After the fact, he says that you've committed sin in marrying her.
Absolutely.
Right? Makes a point that it was a spiritual scandal, right? Okay. But all right, this is where we are. Time to come on back. Time to repent. Time to find God and continue, right? So God taught you both, trained you both in all the things that we teach. Everything that you see on the TV show, which you didn't have that back then. Everything that you read in the books, which you didn't have at that point. But those things were being taught to you. You were coming, you were learning, and you studied, you learned all these basic definitions. And I know I am summing up a large period,
Sure.
large swath. But that process continued to the point that God made you his child, and God made her his child. So you're both now saved. You're both now children of God. You're following his voice. You're trusting his influence. But you're also young in that process, and everyone has issues, right? Everyone has things they need to continue to die to. I can see God pointed out early on with her this issue of control.
Yeah.
And manipulation within the marriage. And then also pointed out your desire, really, to go along with it, to be controlled rather than confront that.
Yeah.
To be controlled and manipulated rather than pay that cost and not be controlled, right? And maybe what we need here is some kind of an example. I hope you've got one of what that looked like for you, one way in which she would control in the relationship.
Yeah, there are several. And, when I think back early on, you're talking about these first 15 years. And during that time, just like you said, God was dealing with me. God was dealing with her. He was very diligent to expose sin on both sides of that equation, right? As you very eloquently carved out. One thing that was recurring, because I was thinking through a lot of examples, and I thought some of these examples, when we were kind of leading up to today preparing, I noticed a commonality in a lot of these specific examples that I had, and it was time. Time was a big deal to her. So let me explain that, and to kind of I give a little more highlight and understanding what I mean there. So God had placed me in the job. I've worked retail for over 30 years, and he very specifically placed me with the company that I was working for, and it required a lot of time. I worked hours that The thing about retail, we joke about that. If you like working when everybody's off or everybody's sleeping, well, then, hey, retail's for you, right? And but unfortunately, it's not always great for the home life. Well, but if we're in the context, okay, as you opened up the podcast about true Christianity, right? We have a true Christian marriage in this case because God had spoken to both of us that we belonged to Him at that point. We still a lot of self to die to, but we were hearing His voice. We were following Him. Well, okay, well then we should reason she had her responsibilities because at that point, God had not asked her to go get a job outside of the home and work and be more of that homemaker. And as we had children later, it was important for her to raise the kids. That was kind of the plan. But yet God was very specific where I needed to work. And so as I would go, again, she had her responsibilities, I had mine. And as I would go about fulfilling those responsibilities, I was away from the house a lot. She didn't like that. I would hear about that. Well, let's not just limit it to that, right? God had put me in the ministry, remnant ministry, with the guys. And at least once a week, we would meet together have a ministry night, a ministry meeting. And it was always uncharacteristic. It would be several hours. We'd meet together. It was great. We would eat. We would have conversation for hours. There was church on Sunday. I was doing some teaching that would require some preparation for that. There was a period of time Jeff and I were doing a jail ministry together. Then we would go in, we would teach. There were some times that even did some discipleship, in my home. And so the picture I'm painting here is that there was a lot of time being invested in the things that God wanted the time invested in. And my work, that was how we lived, okay? But it was part of it. It was the specific job He gave me. The ministry responsibilities were these specific responsibilities He gave me. And she did not like sharing that time with God. If by extension, right? I mean, that makes it ugly when we say it that way.
Yeah.
But that's what was going on. And so that her desire to want time and her definition of family time, right? If she didn't get that, well, then she would show me her displeasure. Okay, there's the old saying, if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy, right? See that on your coffee mug or your placard on the wall. And but how wicked is that, right? Because what by extension we were saying there, what she was saying by expressing her displeasure, by speaking out, wish you would stay home, or, I really want this time, or being offended by those things. What she was saying was and then where the manipulation came in was, well, if you loved me, you would, and again, she would maybe say those words, but that was the message, right? Because I'm not happy with you. You're out spending all this time at work, or you're doing these ministry things, but where's my time with you? I get that time. I am owed that time. And so that was her sin in that, because that was putting her selfish desires ahead of the kingdom of God, and that's wicked. Well, where was my sin in that? My sin was allowing that voice to remain in my ear and pull me. And I would give in because there was that tug that was there. And what ended up happening is over time that this was eroding and cutting into the ministry opportunity and the heart that God wanted me to have as a shepherd, right? And the responsibility He wanted me to have in the ministry. I can't be that guy. I can't be God's guy and then have this double-mindedness to where, okay, I got to go make the wife happy. Okay, well, hey, look what time it is. I got to be going, right? And I've already been gone 3 nights this week. I don't know if none of that should be an issue, right? If I'm going to follow God with a whole heart. But where I sinned was, it was just easier to give in and to try to appease her in that way to avoid the conflict, right? What's the other wicked little saying? Happy wife, happy life, right? That's kind of one we hear about today. Worldly, fleshly, that's not rooted anywhere in the kingdom of God, right? But that's what I was doing. And I was allowing that relationship to influence me in a negative way.
Yeah, and I want to make the point too that it doesn't mean that you won't make decisions that accommodate.
Absolutely.
Right? And I love the example because I think everyone that has any family ties at all understands this whole time thing. When you and friends will do this too. Hey, when are you going to come hang out?
Yeah.
And to say that without a control and manipulation is fine. It's like, hey, we want to see you. I understand that. That's love, and that is reaching out a hand, in a way. But hey, you should be coming and seeing us. Well, how do you know that? Maybe that's not what you should be doing. But so I want to make that distinction of the problem. And I loved how you you set the stage so well with that, because it was God said you were to do certain things as far as your job, your ministry, and that defined your time.
Yep.
Hands off, hands off, mama,
Yeah.
God said, this is how my time should be spent. But she didn't do that, right? She had her own agenda there. But really the problem that came in with you was not necessarily that you did or didn't do a certain thing at a certain time. It's the pull within the heart to compromise what God has spoken to you.
Yes.
And it's the compromise that's the problem, not necessarily the outward action.
Correct.
And everyone needs to understand that.
Yes.
We're not saying don't spend time with your wife, don't
Absolutely.
spend time with your family. We're not saying there won't come a time it's like, well, I have been gone 3 nights this week. But, when God says you need to be gone that 4th night, then that is this thing that God has defined. Yeah. And everyone better take their hands off of it. That should paint a picture as to where everyone should be staying, Yeah. And so, dude, I love that example. I really do. Because I think everyone can understand what's going on there.
So I'm going to go ahead and insert this at this point.
All right.
Okay. The thing has been kind of bubbling up inside of me, on this topic. So there will be people that will hear this, right? That will hear maybe this example, and you can hear the flesh voice that's like, well, that doesn't sound unreasonable, what she's asking for. I mean, they're husband and wife, right? I mean, they should spend time together. And you can just hear the flesh voice arguing against that. And here's the point leading up to this that God made to me. In our society today, okay, and I'm sure this is going to come up again, in the church world today, as we call the false church, the family unit has been elevated to godhood. And I want that to have the sting, every bit of that I'm, every force behind it, it needs to be there, the weight. It's God making the point. The family unit is worshipped in society and in church today. I grew up, I remember seeing the little scale. I remember being in Sunday school classes, and it was God first, family second, others, work. You were taught this cute little hierarchy, but nobody lived it. So let me just make this point. Luke 14:26. And right before that, we had all these crowds that were gathering around Jesus, and they were going along. So he turns to him and he says this, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, which we're talking about that, he cannot be my disciple. Let's just stop right there. I mean, you can't be his disciple. And I can already hear the other voices that, to argue and, well, that's what Jesus said. And is what you're talking about really, does God still require that today? And the culture was different. How about Hebrews? Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And Michael, you already did a good job of balancing the equation, but, right after those verses in Matthew 10, that you quoted leading into this, Jesus said the same thing kind of a different way. But he said, he who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. He who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. And here's what's the point? And you did a great job carving it out. The point that Jesus is making is he doesn't want us to hate these people. And as you were saying, it doesn't mean that he doesn't want us to spend time with our wife or spend time with our children. But when it comes to putting those things above him and above what he's speaking, it should never happen in a real Christian relationship, right? And so that's the thing, the vision I catch for this when we're talking through these things. It's not that there were plenty of times it was right for me to spend time with my wife, and God was really good to provide moments for that. But when he was also using the knife to cut away the flesh and to say, hey, wife, your relationship with your husband should not ever be elevated above me. Hey, Mr. Husband, your relationship with your wife or your children should never be placed in front of me. I was reading in Ezekiel this week. Ezekiel's wife died, and God told him not to mourn. And he ended up having Ezekiel, he used him as a sign to his people, and his people were getting rebuked at the time. So God's slant, his position on the family, is a little different than what our societal perception and slant on the family is, or the church world, the false church. So had to throw that in.
Dude, that is exactly where I wanted to go with that concept, because I hear that verse about if you do not hate, you are, all these things that you love, all the things that the whole world and the church tells you, the false church, tells you should love. If you don't hate these things, you cannot be my disciple. And I hear the screams, all the outrage. Well, we're not supposed to hate. Okay. And what I want to do is say it this way, which is kind of what your Ezekiel point was. If you don't want to go to God and understand what he meant when he said hate, and have him define what that looks like in terms of a marriage and in terms of, father and children, if you don't want to take the time, even 10 minutes, the 5 minutes that it requires to just look to God and say, God, what do you mean by that? Because that blows my mind.
Yeah.
If that's not you, then this is not for you.
Absolutely.
Okay? It just isn't. And because I thought about it, it's like, well, I could go and I could say, well, you need to understand what Jesus was saying. You can kind of talk about it. The other verse kind of makes the point. If you don't love more, you shouldn't love more than me. Okay, and that is the point. But if the word hate in that verse offends you, then good.
Yes.
Let it then let it offend. And I'm sorry, this isn't for you. We're going to go find someone that can hear that word hate and not just shut off God and just turn it off and just be so offended that we're not even going to look and question that maybe I'm not God, that maybe God is God and I'm not. And so his definition of things matter, and maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah.
That's what we're looking for.
Absolutely.
Who's willing to hear that word hate and say, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I don't see it right. Rather than immediately jumping up and forming a crusade against this True Christian podcast that they use the word hate in reference to family. Okay.
Well, we're in good company.
Absolutely.
Jesus said it, right? And, when I look at this, there was another time the Pharisees were coming to Jesus and they said, they were trying to trap him, but what's the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all of your soul, all of your mind, and all of your strength. And the second commandment is like it. You love your neighbors yourself. And we talk about these things. God is everything. It is right. We are the created things. And it is right that we submit to His lordship, that He is Lord of our family and He knows best, right? He knows what is best. And so Jesus said it.
Yeah. Yeah, He did. And the other thing that comes up as I hear that verse about loving your family more than God is there are so many who would hear that and say, oh, no, that's not me. I go to church every Sunday.
Yeah.
Whether my family wants to come or not. Okay, that's not what we're talking about.
Absolutely not.
I do my quiet time every morning, even though it means I lose sleep or I don't have that time with family. So, yeah, I'm definitely putting God first. No, you're not.
Yeah.
The question is, and the example of where it got nitty-gritty for you with the call of God in the beginning makes the point that what we're talking about is the place where God has spoken. God said you need to do, be at this certain location. You need to be at this Bible study on Thursday nights. And the wife doesn't like that. That's what we're talking about. Yeah. What has God said? And if you're out there thinking God doesn't speak, then you don't know what we're talking about. You need to learn what we're talking about because it's something different than what everyone out there is saying, oh, put God first, while they're really just doing whatever they want. Yeah. The only way to put God first is to ask the question, where's the Lord, and find Him and hear what He says and do that. And that is the point where you'll feel that rub and it will get real for you.
Relinquish control. And that's what God was speaking to me back to my story. It was, you go through those examples. Oh, hell, I have my quiet time. I do this, I do that. And you can hear all the religious self-justification. I know. I've been there.
Right.
I live that, right? I know what that is. And that's such a chasm of difference between actually engaging the Creator of the universe, where I surrender. My will becomes broken and I relinquish control. That's what we're talking about.
Right.
He becomes Lord. And before I forget it, just because I thought about it, this whole concept of family, and we've been accused of that, right? About, oh, hey, those folks, they're anti-family. That is not what we're saying. In fact, the only real way I can love my family and be the man that I should have been more in my marriage, when I would acquiesce or succumb to manipulation and control because I wasn't being who I was supposed to be. And I know we'll get deeper into the weeds on that. But the reality is the only way I can really love my wife and my kids and my neighbor and everyone is by truly loving God first. There is no other way. Anything else falls short of love. It's not love.
Right.
So,
yeah. It's self.
Yeah.
And that, coming back to the story, we're talking about that control and the manipulation that was going on in terms, specifically with time as one example. And you can see how when that is going on and there's a giving in, not a giving in terms of like scheduling, but in terms of what God has said and actually taking weight in the heart off of the thing that God has said, which is, no, I need to be over here on Thursday nights. But to somehow soften or lessen the importance of what God has spoken there, that's really the problem.
Yeah.
It's not about the schedule, right?
Yeah.
It's about the heart. And truly, when the heart is right, it will dictate the schedule. And it doesn't go the other way, right? And so this happens over years, right? And so what you have is a scenario where you should have been the single man with only an ear to God, and a single man that was making decisions in reference and in this whole environment of where is the Lord? And that being the only concern, that's the question that's asked when you go to buy a car, or when you consider a job, or when you consider someone to marry, or what do you do with your time? Where is the Lord is everything. And that was compromised for you because of these moments of choice, of preference. Of I'd rather it just be a little easier for me. And I don't want to pay that cost. And that's had
a divided heart.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so there's God needs a guy to stand on the wall and to maintain that standard and say, no, this is the line between our country and yours, and to defend that and to build the wall and to train up people. He needed a guy, right? And he got a divided version of that, right?
Yes.
And that progressed within your relationship to the point that with this time issue, in particular, to where she was wanting to control when the Bible study met or when the group met through you, because, well, if I can make my husband not available for that time slot, maybe I can move the whole group, or however it was that played out. And so this is growing, this is a lesion that's becoming much worse, and it's affecting more than just you.
Yeah. So
in this process, God was, like we said at the beginning, the answer to what do you do in the beginning, middle, and end of your marriage is what is God saying?
Yeah.
And God was continuing to speak throughout all of this to both of you. God was speaking to her about this desire to control, about this manipulative kind of grasp that she had on you and that she desired to have.
And then not wanting to be wrong in the course of that, in the context of that. Yeah.
So it wasn't like this was happening in a vacuum, right? God was displaying the truth of what's really in the heart for both of you as this was going on, right?
Absolutely.
So as you're going through that, and you clearly see the pull for you because, outside of God, every man wants happy wife, happy life, right? Outside of God, if nothing matters, then okay, might as well be at peace at home, right? But then God begins to illuminate that and says, well, yeah, she does have this thing going on, and it's not right, but you've got your own thing. So how did that hit you? How did you respond to that kind of confrontation from God about this in your heart?
So not well. I look, and again, we're still within that context of the first 15 years where we're talking about, and I can remember having conversations, and I remember Jeff pointing out things. I can remember dreams I would have or things in the moment that I would see, and God was illuminating, as you're talking about, this whole issue was happening, and I wasn't taking it serious enough because I'm thinking, oh, well, I'm still about what I need to be about, right? And there's inner self-voice, tell me that. And so I'm like, things are okay. I'm okay. Until things were not okay. And God was so good to allow, he was giving me time to draw the right conclusions and to repent, to die a deeper death in those things in relation to my marriage. And I was dragging my feet with that until it reached a point in 2007. Enough was enough. God called me onto the carpet for that and made very clear to me things were not going to continue. I had a choice that I had to make at that point. So we're like, what's that, 14, 15 years in at that point. And in fact, to the point that I was off work one day and I had taken a little nap on the couch. And Michael, I'm not going to say that it was an audible voice, but it was dang close. I heard clearly, "You will lose your marriage." I sat straight up on the edge of the couch, and I turned, put my feet flat on the ground.
And is there anyone else in the room?
There was no one else in the room. The wife might have been in the kitchen, but I was in the living room on the couch. And I heard that, and it resounded. It was like thunder when I heard that in my heart, my mind. I knew exactly what God had said, and it freaked me out. Okay? And that was him. Everything was leading up to this time. He'd been very patient. And again, God, what's the moral of the story? Hear and trust and obey. It's the best way, right? And I had been reluctant to do that. I'd been unwilling to do that, to draw the line. Let's make that ugly. Unwilling, right? To draw the line that I needed to. And so God made this point. This is what's going to happen. And man, that flipped my lid. Okay? Sent me in a little bit of a tailspin, from there. And so at that point, I would love to say that I'm this picture perfect story, that I did everything right, that I heard and I quickly agreed with God, which I could have done that, right? There was still that choice there, but I ran from that. And then all of these embedded motives and deep-seated and twisted roots and perceptions inside of me that weren't right were exposed just with him speaking that one thing, because now it's like, oh, crap. All the connotation of that, right? I don't want to lose my marriage. I know how that's looked as, even, as a minister or as a good person of society, or how I'd always perceived what that would mean. Of course, I didn't know exactly how that was going to play out right at that time, but God was very clear on what he said, and I knew what it meant, and I knew he meant business. And just going down that, exploring that whole avenue of what that means to lose the marriage, man, I didn't want that. So I ran. I tucked my tail, and I ran from that reality. And I didn't want others to perceive me as someone who had failed in a marriage, and I didn't want to see myself as someone who had failed in their marriage. I didn't want to be the guy that, worst case scenario there, got his kids every other weekend or whatever the case may be, and all the costs associated with that. But one thing was clear, God had spoken.
Right. So I want to make a point right here, because I think there's going to be a lot of people, probably the people that are going to tune into this podcast or watch the show probably have some level of religious background. It's more likely. That may not always be the case, but what you're describing of what people think of you, I'm going to call the popular frown, right? And this is, I forget exactly, I'm quoting someone else in that. It might
incur the unpopular frown.
It might be,
maybe.
Is it Wilberforce maybe? I can't remember.
I don't remember exactly.
But I mean, I didn't come up with that. We didn't come up with that, but that's the idea. And I want to bring that up because that is so ingratiated in the religious life. People don't dress up on Sundays for God. Even though they say it's not for God. It's because they want to look good. They want to do all they can to make sure they do not incur the popular frown. Yeah. The world out there somehow looking down on them. Okay, that is so incredibly far away from actual persecution. No one's getting limbs hacked off. No one's going to jail. And yet we're so afraid of upsetting this, this taboo status quo that is decided by who? Yeah. It's arbitrary. Yeah. It is arbitrary in one sense, and yet it's very deliberate in the other sense, because it is just any direction and any other direction than where God is. Yeah. And we're all going to have this consensus together, and shame on you if you do anything to move outside of that, because then you're not one of the special ones like we are. I mean, it's wicked. It is unbelievably wicked. And I bring that up because if we see that right and we feel that pull to do or not do something, and we see it right, it's like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
I'm going to reject God for this mob mentality that a bunch of wicked people came into consensus on?
Yeah.
What? I mean, the world likes all kinds of things that are horrible and will kill you. And I've endured the popular frown by just not indulging.
Yeah.
I've never been a drinker, and I have been frowned upon for not being a drunkard. It's ridiculous. So that is incredibly important for anyone who's listening out there, because that's all that boils down to.
Absolutely.
It is incredibly simple, and the concern is so small. And yet, especially in the religious mindset, it is elevated to godhood. It's another one of those sacred cows.
Mm-hmm.
And you, heaven forbid, you go against that.
Yeah.
And yet, wouldn't you think God knows?
Yeah.
God knows better, like God has a clue as to what's good for you and where you ought to be as a person.
And that's the voice of the flesh. And what does Paul say, like in Romans 8 and all throughout, that the flesh, the flesh is in constant conflict with the things of the Spirit. In fact, the mindset on the flesh cannot please God. Uh-oh.
Ooh, that's a problem.
Yeah. But that's what was going on in me, right?
I'm going to need to take a break.
Yep, okay.
I gotta pee.
Okay.